Anger leads to eruptions of protest in Georgia. Thousands of pro-EU demonstrators marched against a controversial foreign agents bill, leading the government to scrap it. But then pro-Russian groups marched, tearing down EU flags. Can Georgia's government continue to straddle the line between the West and Russia? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Georgia. Often considered a beacon of democracy in the post-Soviet space, some fear Georgia has been turning too far toward Russia. With the support of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, the People's Power Party introduced what some labeled anti-democratic legislation that would force NGOs and media organizations receiving funding from other countries to register as foreign agents. Now, the government had to change their position rather quickly after major backlash when thousands of Georgians took to the streets and clashed with police. So where does Georgia and its government stand now? Here's a look.
Georgia is a small country that won its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. It has since played a delicate balancing act between pro-European sentiment and its powerful neighbor, Russia. It applied for EU candidacy in March last year, but a delay in receiving candidacy now appears to have strengthened Russia's pull. It's against this backdrop that Georgia's parliament started discussing two new bills. Submitted by the People's Power Party, the bills require individuals, civil society organizations, and media outlets to register with the Justice Ministry as agents of foreign influence if they receive at least 20% of their funds from abroad.
The future of our country doesn't belong and will not belong to foreign agents and the servants of foreign countries. The future of our country and the people belongs to the patriots.
They also impose additional reporting requirements, inspections, and administrative and criminal liabilities, including up to 5 years in prison for any violations. But the announcement faced major backlash. The international community condemned the proposal, while tens of thousands of Georgians took to the streets. Opponents say the plan is anti-democratic and pushes the country in an increasingly authoritarian direction. They also believe it's modeled on a 2012 Russian law that Moscow has used to crack down on civil society and media. A claim denied by the ruling party, Georgian Dream.
Georgian society absolutely deserves to know which organizations are being financed, from which source, and what kind and how that money is being spent. We are talking about accountability and transparency. There are no restrictions whatsoever placed on people by this law.
On the second night of protests outside the parliament in Tbilisi, the bills were scrapped, and for a moment it looked like a political crisis had been averted. But analysts say the crisis is far from over. On Tuesday, supporters of the conservative movement and the pro-Russian platform Alt-Info tore down the EU flag in front of the parliament building. They're protesting against Western influence in Georgia and in favor of closer relations with Russia. And after initially backing down, the ruling party struck isolationist and ultra-conservative notes as it continued to justify the law.
Radicalism in Georgian society, this was caused by the fake news that was blaming us that we are adopting Russian law from the one hand, and it was very wrong perception that this adoption of law would mean to not to go with our European way.
But as the war rages between Russia and Ukraine, the country may find it harder to straddle the line between East and West. This week, the Georgian Prime Minister accused Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky of meddling in his country's politics. Zelensky had thanked protesters for waving Ukrainian flags, saying it showed respect, and he wished Georgians democratic success. Russia sees the Georgian protests as a coup attempt and accuses the West of inciting unrest.
Очень похоже на киевский Майдан.
There is no doubt at all that the bill on registration of those NGOs which receive foreign financing in amount of mere 20% of their budget served only as a pretext to start, generally speaking, an attempt to violently change power in Georgia.
The bills, although dropped, have fueled domestic criticism of the government as being too close to Moscow. That's in contrast to the Georgian public opinion, which remains fiercely anti-Russian.
Well, joining me now to speak more about Georgia's political and social dynamics in the face of mass protests are from Tbilisi. Sergi Kapanadze, he is the former vice speaker of the Georgian parliament and former deputy foreign minister of Georgia. And from Washington, Temuri Yakobashvili, he is the former Georgian ambassador to the United States and former deputy prime minister. Now, we did reach out to the Georgian government as well as government-supported think tanks, but unfortunately no one could participate on today's program. And that is an issue here because several times we've actually tried to get government voices on the show and have always been politely declined. And so, Sergei, I have to ask, why is it so difficult to get someone to defend what the government is pushing for and thinks is in Georgia's best interest?
Hi, it's an honor to be here. It's a very simple explanation, because when you have the increased authoritarianism, as we have in Georgia right now, usually authoritarian leaders and their representatives do not like to get engaged in the debates with political opponents, especially on the topics which they are prone to lose. So I'm not surprised that nobody's here. It's been a very long time since I've had an opportunity to debate anybody representing the government's point of view. They only do their propaganda through their media channels.
Temuri, let me ask you, I mean, is it fair to use the word authoritarianism here? Because this is an elected government, and there are pro-Russian demonstrators that we're seeing on the streets of Georgia.
I'm afraid increasingly so, because what we are seeing is not surprising, because either government has nothing else to say, or they are very good only in parroting whatever script they're receiving from the Russian Federation. And if you are scrolling the Georgian news and what government or government talking heads are talking about, or even the wording that they are using, it increasingly started to sound like Russians talking to their own public. So
it's unfortunate.
It seems to me that I have to agree with Sergi that they have nothing to say.
It's unfortunate, and hopefully they'll be hearing this program, and that might prompt someone to come forward and just speak to us in as much of a balanced debate format as possible. So, okay, let's get back to what is now happening, what we've seen happening on the streets of Tbilisi, especially over the last weeks. Sergei, what really led to this foreign agent legislation being tabled in the first place? Why is the government actually concerned with foreign agents infiltrating, especially NGOs?
Well, it's really about the foreign agents per se, obviously. The government has been saying it's about the transparency of association, by the way, the term that Hungarian leaders have used when they were trying to adopt a similar law, which was struck down by the European Court of Justice. It's a whole different issue here. The issue is that in the increased authoritarian society, with the government who wants to monopolize and centralize power, they're going after everybody who is critical of. So political opposition is the first so-called victim. They're still standing strong, but they were the first to be demonized. The second one came media. We have now the situation in which all media organizations, the main critical TV channels, have the ongoing court cases. Director of one of the largest opposition media channels was arrested last year. And now it's the turn of the civil society organizations, because civil society here and the NGOs, they're not controlled by the government. You only have one or two think tanks maybe, which have been gongos, which have been supporting the government, but more than 90% are healthy in terms of not being dependent on the government. And the think tanks and the NGOs here, including the watchdogs, they are all sustained with the foreign funding. So this law, exactly from the playbook that Putin used as early as 12 years ago, is about that. It's about controlling the NGOs, cutting their finances, and receiving instruments how to then effectively lead to the shutdown of the NGOs or hampering their work. That's what it
Okay.
was about.
Interestingly enough, Temuri, though, the U.S. fundamentally has the same law in place, yet it's actually condemning the law in Georgia. So tell us what the difference is between the foreign agents' law in the U.S. and what they think is so wrong with something similar being implemented in Georgia.
I have to profoundly disagree with you that American legislation has nothing to do with what Georgian government suggested. And there are tons of papers elaborating differences and elaborating how in spirit and in everything these two legislations differ from each other. What Georgian legislation is carbon copy of is a Russian legislation. And if you look at the Russian independent media, who are all labeled as a foreign agent, and as every single organization that is not controlled by Kremlin is labeled as a foreign agent, that's what Georgian government is trying or was trying, and I believe is still going to try to impose on Georgian population. I would say that one have to look at this process in a broader context of what is happening in Ukraine, in Moldova, and what is happening in Georgia. These are pieces of the same puzzle, but that's a different conversation altogether. But going back to your question, I don't think that that legislation was introduced only to control Georgian free speech and free mind, but it was also introduced because Georgian government, unfortunately, was told so.
Sergei, I imagine you agree, but picking up on something Temuri was just explaining, what do you think Georgia's situation right now says about other former Soviet states, including, Belarus, Moldova, even Ukraine?
Well, look, that we have the authoritarian regime which tries to monopolize power, even at the expense of derailing our European integration path. That is not to say that there is no resistance here, because by the end of the day, we did manage to stop them from adopting this law. We had protests. There was a very strong reaction domestically from the civil society, from students, from the opposition parties, from media. And in the end, the same people who voted hastily in favor of this law, then they voted in 2 days against because they had to, because the pressure was big here internally. So we are not yet where Belarus or other totalitarian or authoritarian states of the post-Soviet world are, but we're getting into that direction. And the reason why they are so discontent with all the critical voices internally is that people like people from the CSOs, from NGOs, from media, as well as the youth who are not susceptible to the Russian-type propaganda coming from the TV channels. These people do not want seeing Belarus, or they don't want seeing Russian type of government here. They want Europe, and the overwhelming majority of Georgia's population wants the same. And that's why these protests were symbolically carrying EU flags. Because we all also understood that if this law passes, then it's effectively closing doors for us to get the EU candidate status, which we were supposed to get last year. But last year we missed the opportunity. The government failed to receive it, also because of the anti-democratic steps. I mentioned the arrest of one of the TV channel directors. It happened one day before the decision to grant us the EU candidate status. And I would say it was that straw that broke the camel's back. And the EU said, no, we're going to give you conditionalities and see how you implement it. And now this law was a complete derailing of that track. And so people here are European in mind, and they want pro-European orientation.
Okay, well then, Temuri, help us understand the fact, that Georgians are overwhelmingly in favor of joining the EU, even of joining NATO, while at the same time voting for a party that does have links to the Kremlin, but that also claims to be Western-leaning. I mean, I don't understand how they seem to think that this can work both ways, with the Georgian Dream Party and the People's Power Party in the lead.
One have to recall that Georgian opposition contested the results of the last election, and there was a huge discontent, and it took the EU representatives' involvement to somehow bring the parties together, because Georgian opposition even refused to join the parliament. So for the sake of stability, Europeans brokered the deal that, okay, this time, in spite of differences, sides will sit together in a parliament and will try to achieve the consensus to implement the 12-point plan suggested by the EU, giving the last chance to the government to actually implement what they were voicing verbally, but doing completely opposite in practices. So this government is not entirely legitimate in the sense of, results of the last elections, which were very seriously rigged and very seriously manipulated. So from that point of view, it's not the Georgian people make the choice to elect this government and then live with the consequences. On the contrary, the problem here is that this government is trying to monopolize everything in order to rig all the elections and represent themselves as a choice.
Let me go back to Sergei. Bidzina Ivanishvili did legitimately beat Mikhail once Mikhail Saakashvili was out, won the election back in the day. So there was a clear dissatisfaction among Georgians with the leadership of the then European-leaning party, led by Mikhail Saakashvili. I know many Georgians see the last election as being interfered with, but we have to at least note that the support for Bidzina Ivanishvili was there at some time, even though he had links to the Kremlin. So, having said that, I need to talk a little bit about Mikhail Saakashvili, who's seen as the leader of the Rose Revolution that pulled Georgia out of the Soviet orbit. He's now very ill. He's actually saying he's about 4 kilograms away, if I'm not mistaken, from organ failure in a Georgian hospital. His supporters actually, some of them believe he's been poisoned. How symbolic and important is he today? Does his survival at this point matter to the dream of many Georgians that want to join the EU, join NATO, and be as far away from Russian influence as possible?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So yes, Saakashvili is indeed in a very dire situation. His health has deteriorated significantly over the last year. He was arrested in November of 2021, and he's been in prison since then. And the medical reports that we've seen in the last few months certainly suggest that in the current condition, in the prison where he is, in the medical facility, he cannot get cured. His health will not improve, which effectively means that he is doomed to either a further serious health deterioration, or even for a fatal outcome. Now, we should understand that it's not the first case when the president of Georgia is being either killed or is dying at the behest of the incumbent. We had the first president in the early 90s, who also died. And that polarized society very, very deeply for a very long time. And only after 2003, it was possible to build bridges with the supporters of the first president. So now we have a situation in which here, politically, Saakashvili, even though he's a controversial figure, still enjoys the support of at least 20% of the population. And this is a significant portion of the country. Now, opposition, totally, not just Saakashvili support, but if you take a total number of the opposition, it was over 50% in the last election. But because of the kind of electoral system we have, Georgian Dream managed to get power. If Saakashvili dies or if his health further deteriorates, we are risking an extremely deep polarization of this society. Okay. And this is not good, neither for the national security nor for our European integration plans. Our European partners have been very clear on that. Make sure that he does not die in prison.
Well, Temuri, what do you think might happen if he perishes in this hospital?
Sergi says it's a very bad news for Georgia because Saakashvili's poisoning is claimed not by Saakashvili's supporters, by 5 renowned doctors. One of them is a Nobel Prize winner doctor, another is a presidential medal winner, congressional medal. So these are the best specialists you can find in the world who are saying that he was poisoned based on the samples that they collected and analyzed. Saakashvili is widely considered as a personal prison of not of the Ivanishvili, but of Putin. And being a symbolic person who, yes, you are absolutely right, he lost election, and it was the first time in Georgian recent history that the ruling party lost election, did not contest it, and gave power to the winner.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to see that happening again. That's what democracy is all about. But unfortunately, the current government and everything they are trying to do is trying to deprive the right from the people, deprive people the right to choose what they want. And in that sense, Saakashvili is not only a symbol of the Georgian success, but it can be a very well, if something happens to him, symbol of the Georgian failure. And it's very important to have in mind that when Ivanishvili won the election, he had 3-4 openly pro-Western parties in his coalition. None of them are there now. None of them. They are partly in opposition, partly vanished.
Sergei, you mentioned the consequences of his death in this case, being for polarization, really, of Georgia. And it's interesting because there was a paper written by the Carnegie Institute just over a year ago, and its title struck me because it was called "Divided Georgia, a Hostage to Polarization." And this was before Saakashvili became ill. Everything. Is Georgia just hostage to its own polarization?
Yes and no. It's a hostage to what many people call polarization, which in reality is a unilateral demonization of all the opponents by the ruling party. When you have the opposition leaders who are being arrested, when you have the critical media, which is being shut down, when you have the civil society, which is attacked, as we saw now. We have all these developments which are aimed at only one thing: monopolizing power, making sure that all the opponents are either kneeling down or they are non-existent, basically. We have this. Obviously, then the other party, the victim, in a way strikes back. When I say by striking back, is that they also become rhetorically, at least, radicalized. That's why media becomes polarized. And when you have the government which does not go to the opposition media, does not engage in any debate, makes all the decisions, there is no power sharing. In this situation, polarization is indeed an outcome, a diagnosis. But this is not the cause. The cause is a decision to demonize and to destroy the opponents. And I think that is the real problem.
Temuri, we are down to our last minute and a half, 2 minutes actually. Just to finish on the legislation that brought so many people out onto the streets. Yes, it has been dropped. So what happens now? I mean, is this debate actually over, or will similar legislation potentially be put forth with different wording? What happens?
It's very interesting that you mentioned that article in Carnegie, because I happen to know the author, and we had a lot of debate. And this protest actually proved author wrong, that Georgia is not a playground of the two towering figures, being it Saakashvili or Ivanishvili. And this demonstration was not only about particular legislation, but about Georgia's choice, where it sees where its future should be. In that sense, I'm afraid that this legislation is just one step of the very long battle, because We've seen now the European Union's flag being burned in front of Georgian parliament by groups that are very closely associated with the ruling party. We've seen the parliament, in parliament, some, conspiracy books, anti-Western conspiracy books will being distributed. We've seen, and we see it even today, the rhetorics of the talking heads of the ruling party parroting Russian narratives, calling opposition a fascist without even knowing the meaning of the word, I guess, and using basically the same language that we hear from our northern neighbor.
Okay.
So I don't think that it's an end of the process or beginning of the end of the process. I think it's a battle that I am sure Georgian people will win. How soon the government will be forced to have elections and lose it, time will show.
Okay, Temuri, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank you both so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers, and thank our viewers as well for tuning in. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.